Every man rejected the 60-year-old widow for being too old until a broken rancher made her feel alive again. Margaret Ellen Hayes stood in front of the bathroom mirror, tracing the lines around her eyes with trembling fingers. 60 years of life mapped across her face, like rivers carving through ancient stone. Her silver hair, once a vibrant chestnut brown that her late husband Thomas used to run his fingers through, now hung in soft waves past her shoulders. She had stopped dyeing it 3 years ago, right after Thomas passed away from the heart attack that had stolen him from her in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. She remembered that day with crystalline clarity. He had been reading the newspaper, complaining about the price of gasoline, when suddenly his hand went to his chest and he looked at her with such surprise, as if death itself had been an unexpected visitor at their door. She had held him as the light left his eyes, calling for help that arrived too late, and in that moment, her life as she knew it ended alongside his. For 2 years, she had mourned in the traditional way. She wore black, attended church, accepted casseroles from well-meaning neighbors, and spent her evenings in the house they had shared for 35 years, surrounded by photographs of a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. It was her daughter, Susan, who finally pushed her toward the world of dating again. At first, Margaret had laughed at the idea. Dating? At her age? The concept seemed absurd, something meant for young people with their whole lives ahead of them. But Susan had been persistent, setting up profiles on websites designed for mature singles, encouraging her mother to attend social events at the community center. The first man Margaret agreed to meet for coffee was named Harold. He was 62, a retired accountant who had lost his wife to cancer 5 years prior. They had exchanged pleasant emails for 2 weeks before agreeing to meet at a small cafe downtown. Margaret had spent hours preparing, selecting a modest blue dress that Susan said brought out her eyes, applying makeup with hands that shook from nervousness. Harold had taken one look at her when she walked through the door and his face had fallen almost imperceptibly. Almost, but not quite enough for Margaret to miss it. They had sat through an awkward hour of conversation, during which Harold mentioned 3 times that his previous wife had been much younger than him, that she had always looked so youthful, that he supposed he had been spoiled by her appearance. He never called again. The second man was worse. Richard, 65, had suggested they meet at a restaurant. When Margaret arrived, he looked her up and down with an expression of barely concealed disappointment and said, "You looked younger in your pictures." She had used recent photographs, unedited, honest representations of who she was. But apparently, who she was wasn't young enough, wasn't smooth enough, wasn't whatever impossible standard Richard had constructed in his mind. Then came Frank, who spent their entire dinner talking about his ex-wife's cosmetic procedures and asking if Margaret had ever considered a facelift. There was William, who confessed halfway through their walk in the park that he was really looking for someone to take care of him in his declining years, someone with more energy, someone who could keep up. The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. Each rejection carved a little deeper into Margaret's heart, not because she had wanted these men particularly, but because of what they represented. A society that had decided her worth as a woman was directly tied to the firmness of her skin and the absence of gray in her hair. After Thomas, she had thought she might find companionship again, perhaps even love. Now she understood that the world saw her differently than she saw herself, where she saw wisdom, experience, and a heart still capable of tremendous love. They saw only a number. 60. Too old, too worn, too much. She stopped going on dates. She told Susan she was happy alone, and part of her believed it. She filled her days with gardening, with volunteer work at the local library, with long walks through the countryside surrounding her small Montana town. She adopted a cat named Whiskers who didn't care how old she was, who loved her simply for the warmth of her lap and the gentleness of her hands. It was on one of those long walks, 6 months after her last failed date, that Margaret found herself standing at the edge of a property she had passed hundreds of times, but never really noticed. The fence was falling apart in places, the paint peeling from the old farmhouse in the distance. A handwritten sign hung crooked on the gate, "Fresh eggs for sale." She didn't need eggs, she had a full carton sitting in her refrigerator at home, but something about the place called to her, a sense of kindred weariness perhaps, a recognition of something broken that was still trying to function. The man who answered her knock on the farmhouse door was tall, with broad shoulders that stooped slightly as if carrying an invisible weight. His hair was more silver than the steel gray of a cloudy sky, his face weathered by decades of sun and wind. He looked at her with eyes the color of worn denim, and in them, Margaret saw something she recognized immediately. Grief, the kind that settled into your bones and became part of who you were. His name was Samuel Crawford, and he had been running the ranch alone for 3 years, ever since his wife June had passed away from the same cruel disease that had taken Harold's wife. But unlike Harold, Samuel didn't seem to be looking for a replacement. He seemed to have accepted his solitude the way one accepts the changing of seasons, as something inevitable and beyond control. Margaret bought a dozen eggs she didn't need, and somehow she found herself sitting on Samuel's porch, drinking coffee from a chipped mug while he told her about the ranch. It had been in his family for 4 generations, but there would be no 5th. His only son had died in a car accident 20 years ago, and the loss had nearly destroyed both Samuel and June. They had rebuilt their lives slowly, carefully, only for death to come calling again. She told him about Thomas, about the newspaper and the surprise in his eyes, about the casseroles and the black dresses and the men who had looked at her and found her wanting. She hadn't meant to share so much, but there was something about Samuel's quiet presence that invited confession. He listened without judgment, without trying to fix or advise. He simply listened. When she left that afternoon, she thanked him for the eggs and the coffee. He thanked her for the company. Neither mentioned seeing each other again, but Margaret found herself walking past his ranch more often after that day. Sometimes she would see him working on the fence, and she would wave. Sometimes he would wave back. Once he left a basket of fresh vegetables on her porch with a note that simply said, "From the garden. Thought you might enjoy. Samuel." She brought him a pie the next day, apple with a lattice crust, Thomas's favorite recipe. They ate it together on his porch, while the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that made Margaret's heart ache with beauty. Their friendship grew slowly, without pressure or expectation. Samuel never commented on her age, never suggested she might look better with fewer wrinkles or darker hair. He seemed to see her as she wished to be seen, as a complete person with a rich history and a heart that still beat with hope. When he looked at her, his eyes didn't scan for flaws or calculate her remaining years of usefulness. He simply looked at her as if she mattered, as if her presence in his life was a gift rather than a consolation prize. One evening, almost a year after their first meeting, they were sitting on his porch watching a thunderstorm roll across the valley. The lightning illuminated the mountains in brilliant flashes, and the thunder rumbled like the voice of something ancient and powerful. Margaret felt small in the face of such natural majesty, but not insignificantly so. Small in a way that made her problems seem manageable. Her years seemed like a blessing rather than a burden. Samuel reached over and took her hand. His palm was rough from years of work, his fingers calloused and strong, but his touch was gentle, almost tentative, as if he was asking permission for something he had no right to request. Margaret looked at him, at this man who had lost as much as she had, who had been broken by life in ways that matched her own fractures. In the flash of lightning, she saw his face clearly, saw the hope and fear mingled there, saw the reflection of her own longing in his weathered features. She squeezed his hand back. They didn't rush into anything. At their age, with their histories, there was no need to hurry. They had learned that life could end in an instant, But they had also learned that the moments between those ants were precious and worth savoring. Samuel started joining Margaret for her walks. She started helping him with the garden. They cooked dinner together, alternating between his farmhouse and her cottage, learning each other's habits and preferences with the patience of people who had nowhere else to be. Susan was thrilled when Margaret finally told her about Samuel. She drove up from Billings to meet him, and Margaret watched nervously as her daughter assessed this man who had somehow become the center of her mother's newly rebuilt world. But Susan's concerns melted away when she saw the way Samuel looked at Margaret, the way he pulled out her chair at dinner and listened intently when she spoke, the way he seemed to genuinely enjoy her company rather than merely tolerating it. After Susan left, having given her enthusiastic approval, Samuel turned to Margaret and said something she would never forget. "Those men who rejected you," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "they were fools. They looked at you and saw the years, but they missed everything those years contained. Every line on your face is a story, Margaret. Every gray hair is a testament to a life fully lived. You're not old. You're experienced. You're beautiful in a way that only time can create." She cried then, for the first time since Thomas's funeral. She cried for all the rejection, for all the moments she had believed the men who told her she was too old, too worn, too much. She cried for the years she had spent feeling invisible, discounted, dismissed. And Samuel held her through it all, his strong arms around her shoulders, his heart beating steadily against her ear. They married on a spring morning in the meadow behind Samuel's farmhouse, with wildflowers blooming around them and the mountains standing witness. Margaret wore a simple white dress, and she did not dye her silver hair or hide her wrinkles. Susan stood beside her, crying happy tears, and a few friends from town filled the small gathering of chairs they had set up on the grass. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel kissed her with a tenderness that made her knees weak, and Margaret thought about all the years stretching before them. Perhaps not as many as she had once had with Thomas, but precious nonetheless. Every day was a gift, every moment a treasure. They merged their households, his ranching expertise combining with her organizational skills to turn the failing property around. They adopted 2 more cats and a dog named Biscuit, who followed Samuel everywhere. Margaret planted a garden beside the farmhouse, growing vegetables and flowers in equal measure. Samuel built her a greenhouse so she could garden even through the harsh Montana winters. On Margaret's 62nd birthday, Samuel surprised her with a trip to the coast, something she had mentioned wanting to do years ago with Thomas, but had never managed. They stood on the beach at sunset, watching the waves crash against the shore, and Samuel wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Thank you," he whispered into her hair. "For what?" she asked. "For walking by my ranch that day, for stopping, for seeing me the way I see you, for proving that it's never too late to start again." Margaret leaned back into his embrace, feeling the solid warmth of him, the reality of this second chance she had never expected to receive. She thought about all the men who had rejected her, who had looked at her age and seen only limitation. They had been so focused on what they thought they wanted that they had missed what was right in front of them. Samuel had been broken, just as she had been broken. But somehow, in finding each other, they had discovered that broken pieces could be fitted together to create something new, something beautiful, something whole. Age had not diminished them. It had refined them, stripped away the pretense and ego of youth, leaving behind only what truly mattered. Love, Margaret realized, did not care about numbers. It did not calculate years or measure worth in wrinkles. Love was 2 people who saw each other clearly, who accepted each other completely, who chose to walk together through whatever time they had left. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Margaret turned in Samuel's arms and kissed him. The wind whipped her silver hair around them both, and somewhere in the distance, a seagull called out over the endless expanse of the sea. She was 62 years old, married to a broken rancher who had made her feel alive again, and she had never been happier. Every man before him had been wrong. She wasn't too old. She had simply been waiting for the right person to see her, truly see her, and love her exactly as she was.